I was trying to play Stump the song leader today. Tom didn't know any of these. And you may not have heard of this one. This is a very famous old hymn too. Condemnation covers us all. We've been talking about Romans chapters 1 through 3 here for a while. And as you may have gathered, Paul first condemns us, and then he provides us with salvation. And frankly, he had a time convincing everybody that was reading his letter and everybody that he came into contact with that condemnation covers us all. We are all sinners. And we want to be. But we're not as bad as we could be, and we'll find that out here in just a minute. This week is the Westminster Kennel Club show. Oh, it's my highlight of my year. I've been watching this thing on TV for the last 20 years. Well, more like 30 years. I don't even know what channel it's on. Fox? PBS? Animal? Really? Animal Planet? Okay. I love the dogs. I love to watch them. I love to boo at the poodles. Sorry, all you poodle lovers out there. I think the judges are very partial to poodles. I don't know. Maybe the standard for poodles is just so low that every poodle matches up to the standard. I really cheer for the sporting dogs and the hounds. I want them to win, but they very rarely do. It's the toys and the miniatures and the poofy little dogs that they win a lot. But anyway. Dogs are not judged against each other. I don't know if you realize this. It's not, I like this dog better than this dog. Dogs are judged on the basis of a standard. Do they come up to the standard for that breed? And you can read those standards in a AKC book, an American Kennel Club book, or you can read them online, and they're supposed to match up to the standard. Does this, I think this is a Clumber Spaniel, but I'm not sure. Does the dog meet the standard? And when we talk about Christians, we have to talk about meeting the standard. We don't compare ourselves, or we shouldn't, actually we do, but we shouldn't compare ourselves to each other. We have to compare ourselves to God's standard. But in Paul's day, they were judging each other by all kinds of standards. We have... What do we think is good? What do we think is bad? I think we pretty much got what's ugly. But we have to think about what is the standard that we judge by. And the standard that we judge by is God. Are we following God's standards? Are we coming up to the standard that is Jesus Christ? And we all come short. And when we judge people by anything less than this, and when we judge people in any way that doesn't measure up to how God judges us, then we have serious problems, and we find out those today. We find out that we have a problem that people who judge others in ways that God doesn't come under God's condemnation. They're the self-righteous people. They're the ones who think that they're better than everybody else. They're the ones that don't think that they have anything wrong with them. Paul creates this imaginary you. He says, you therefore have no excuse. Well, the you is an imaginary person. He makes him up. I think he's part Jewish because Paul was Jewish, and he realized that the Jewish people at that time thought that they were better than everybody else in the world. It could be any self-righteous person. Any person who thought that they didn't need to measure up to God's standard. Anybody who didn't think that there was enough sin in their lives to condemn them. And Paul says those people are come under God's condemnation. So he says you, and he begins with the fact that you have no excuse. Now, last week we talked about a number of different sins. It starts off with murderers and rapists and adulterers, and it ends up with gossips and people who are disobedient to their parents. And you can say, well, I'm not a murderer. I'm not as bad as those people. But Paul wants to eliminate any kind of person who says that they are good enough to get into heaven. And he says, everyone, you and I, have no excuse. We're no better than anybody else on this planet. The so-called righteous people are just as guilty before God as anyone else. They could be Jews, they could be Gentiles. It's anyone who thinks that they aren't bad enough, that they are good enough to get into heaven, because none of us are. And Paul puts us all on the same plane, and he put himself on the same plane. The first basis of their guilt is that they pass judgment on people and they don't even realize that they are sinners themselves. That their sin isn't bad enough for God to be angry at. This is similar to Christ condemning people who condemn others back in Matthew chapter 7. He says, beware when you are judging other people, that you don't judge people in a way that you don't want to be judged. Now, frankly, I want to be judged with a huge dose of mercy. And I hope you do too. You know, God doesn't say don't judge. In fact, the verses right after Matthew chapter 7 here says, don't cast your pearls before swine. Well, how do you know what a swine is? It's got 4 legs and a little snout, a little curly tail. You know, you have to be able to evaluate what a swine is. So God isn't saying don't judge. He is saying judge the way you want to be judged. And if we don't realize that we need mercy, we're not going to get any mercy from Him. Scripture clearly tells us that when we admonish each other, that we are not supposed to be caught up in the sin ourselves. But we judge other people as an act of love. We want them to know that they're in danger. We want them to know that they're not coming up to God's standard. And so we tell them, and we help them, and we love them because we want to be helped, and we want to be loved. He goes on to say that we have to be certain of our own spiritual state. And our spiritual state is one where we need mercy. If we're judging other people on the basis of a condemnation that it contains no mercy, we are in a lot of trouble ourselves. We want to be judged with mercy. They condemn themselves because they practice the same things. I don't know where that got that guy from. He doesn't realize that he does the same sins as everybody else. He just sticks his head in the sand, and there it sits. He doesn't realize that he is under the same condemnation as everybody else. This does not mean that Jews and Gentiles are horrible people. They don't commit murder. You know, we know lots of people in this world who aren't as bad as they could be. But they still commit sins. And they've committed many of the sins on this list that we talked about last week. They are still in need of condemnation. It's just that when we don't realize that we're sinners, and we don't realize how holy God is, we can be in lots of trouble. Paul goes on to say that God's judgment in such things is always based on truth. It's not based on partial information. It's not based on emotions. It is based on truth. When God condemns sin, He does so justly, and He does so fairly. Divine judgment is based on the facts. Now, some of you are old enough to remember who that guy is. That was Sergeant Joe Friday. And his catch line was, just give me the facts, ma'am, just the facts. You know, he didn't want to know what their opinion was. He didn't want to know what they thought about the situation. He didn't want to know who they guessed the murderer was. He just wanted the facts, and he was going to judge fairly. And Joe Friday did. No, he was just as biased as anybody else. But God judges fairly. He knows all the facts in the case. He knows all that's going on. And so He can judge fairly. On the basis of God's judgment, that God judges fairly, He repeats the basic problem. We're hypocrites. We want to judge other people, and we don't want to be judged ourselves. We want to judge other people according to the standard without mercy, and yet we want a huge dose of mercy. We can never look down on or judge others when we ourselves are not right with God. And that happens so often. We need to be right with God and get it into our heads that we are sinners as well as everybody else on this planet. We're sinners, and when we point fingers at others, we're pointing fingers back at ourselves. And we condemn ourselves whenever we judge other people. But we also want to promise them mercy.